This is about defending democracy. This is no longer Democrats versus Republicans. What do you want your kids to believe in? There must be give and take.
This is White Flag with Joe Walsh.
John Harwood, longtime reporter, journalist, the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, NBC, CNBC, most recently CNN. He's been around and done and reported on so much. And John, I'm honored to speak with you. I've been looking forward to speaking with you because there's been a problem that I've wrestled with ever since Trump came on the scene, which is how the hell do you cover him and his ilk? And I really wanted to get your viewpoint on this. Let's start with today's Wednesday. This past Sunday, Leslie Stahl interviewed Marjorie Taylor Greene on 60 Minutes, and much of the middle, the center, and the left, I think, was outraged that she even sat down with Marjorie. What was your take? What's your take on that, John? On even profiling her on 60 Minutes?
Well, first of all, let me just say it's a hard problem to decide how to handle this stuff. So I'm not pretending that it's easy.
Yeah.
The question of how to handle people like her and Trump as well comes at a time when journalism's under severe economic stress, both in print and on television. And so there's certainly a tension between things you do to try to preserve and build, if possible, an audience, and communicating what you yourself believe to be true. So people will come to different judgments on that, but I can only do the work the way it feels comfortable to me. When I watched Leslie's piece, and I have a lot of respect for Leslie Stahl, have a lot of respect for 60 Minutes, have for a long time. But when I watched that piece, I thought that profiling Marjorie Taylor Greene as if she was a normal politician, a little bit on the edge, and framing it as, can she build, she's got a lot of clout, can she build her clout, is the wrong framing. I think that Marjorie Taylor Greene is a symptom of the sickness that has overtaken the Republican Party. She's a kook, and things like saying, you say that the Democrats are the party of pedophiles.
Yeah.
Well, that is not a view that you respect, that you say, oh, well, she says they're pedophiles and Democrats say they're not. No, that's to me, the way to talk about Marjorie Taylor Greene is her as a symptom of what's overtaken the Republican Party. Extreme, crazy beliefs, if they are in fact beliefs, as opposed to things that people deliberately lie about. The election lie, for example. People talk about, oh, well, the election was stolen. No, it was not stolen. And I think that journalists should be very comfortable in communicating what they know to be true. And if you believe that you know it, I think it is your obligation as a journalist to say that. And so to act as if we are indifferent to the truth or falsity of what someone is saying, the morality or immorality of what someone is saying, to me, that's not the way to do it. And I think that now,
do you, John, back up for a moment? Do you? And I hear you, and I agree with a lot of that. My response has been, and tell me, push back on this if you disagree.
Yeah.
Sadly, Marjorie Taylor Greene, in my mind, is almost one of the most influential members of Congress. I think she's got Kevin McCarthy by the short hairs. In many ways, she's the speaker. So I think she needs to be covered. As wacky and as dishonest as she is, she's important, and she needs to be covered. I didn't have a problem with 60 Minutes sitting down with her to begin with. Do you have a problem with that?
No, I mean, but to me, the sitting down with the person and getting her to articulate these crazy beliefs that she
Yeah.
has, um, that is not the core story. The
Yeah.
core story is that she is a symptom of the crisis in American democracy as a result of the crisis within the Republican Party. And so, if you frame the story that way, that has a different effect than profiling her as a rising stateswoman within the Republican Party or a rising political figure within the Republican Party,
Yeah.
and acting as if her views are credible. They're not, and I think we all know that in our guts. Now, if it were done my way, would that make
Yeah.
a difference? I don't know. You know, I've heard a couple of reactions to the view that I'm expressing. One is, well, you know, 60 Minutes sat down with Charles Manson 40 years ago. Why can't they sit down with Marjorie Taylor Greene? Or why not expose the American public to her views and let them make their own decisions? Okay, I respect those views, but on the Manson point, Manson was on. I haven't gone back and looked at the interview,
Yeah.
but I'm pretty sure they didn't get on with Charles Manson and debate A, whether the murders were committed, and B, whether they were justified. Right? I think they were looking at the mind of a killer. Right?
So John, and I agree spot on with this. So how do you do that? And take your example. There's Leslie, and Leslie says to Marjorie, Marjorie, you've said the Democratic Party is the party of pedophiles. Well, what did you mean? Do you really believe that? And Marjorie then spews her nonsense.
Right.
Then if you're Leslie, then what do you do? How do you push? What do you do in that situation?
Well, I mean, what she did in the clip that I saw was that she kind of rolled her eyes and said, "Wow, okay."
Yeah, yeah.
Well, no, it's not okay. And so first of all, you don't have to air an extended disquisition by Marjorie Taylor Greene on this, fantasy bullshit.
Exactly.
Right? You can say, the reporter can say, in fact, she's so crazy that she calls Democrats pedophiles. You don't have to air her clip of saying that. I mean, you can if you want to.
Oh,
but,
I see.
But her interview is in the service of the story that you're telling. It's not the story. And so, I mean, you wouldn't put on, if she has sort of renounced her embrace of QAnon.
Right.
There may be members of Congress who are full on embracing QAnon right now. I don't know that for sure, but it's certainly possible. Would you put somebody on and say, this person represents a big faction of the Republican Party, and they believe that Democrats are drinking the blood of children, and why do you believe that? Is that really true? Or that I don't think that's true. No, you use that to show and tell the story of how far the Republican Party has gone. That's the story.
Right.
And that's my view.
You wouldn't, John, I was frustrated with that clip. You're right. Leslie said, "Wow." And then she said, "Okay." Mm-hmm. I wish she had just read Marjorie the definition of a pedophile and said, again, Marjorie, you really believe that Joe Biden and Democrats are pedophiles? And if Marjorie says yes, my thinking has always been there's no gotcha with people like that. The gotcha is in letting them speak. Let Trump spew his nonsense and his lies, because I want the American people to hear it. I want the American people to know how fucking nutty and dishonest Marjorie Taylor Greene is. Let her speak. But maybe that's not, in your mind, maybe that's not the way you do it.
I mean, the matter is, how much of your journalistic real estate are you going to give over to that?
It's a good point.
There was a big debate in 2016 over whether television networks should have carried all these Trump rally.
Yeah.
Now you could say, well, look at the crazy stuff he's saying. We will show the rallies, and A, it's newsworthy because he's a prominent candidate for president, and B, it'll show people how crazy he is and let them make their own judgments. I don't. I'm not overly critical of what television networks did in 2016. I think that was a new phenomenon and people weren't sure.
Yeah.
But again, it's a hard question. I experienced this. You may recall we had a debate
Yes.
on CNBC
Yeah.
that I moderated along with colleagues. And I made the decision myself to take a different approach. I had seen my colleagues in television interviewing Trump and saying things like, "You say Mexico is going to pay for the wall. How are you going to do that?" And they were sort of talking as if this was a credible idea, and they were talking about how you do it.
Right.
I had a different notion. Not that it was more successful, but I had a different notion. And that notion was to take as a presumption that this was a preposterous idea that was never going to happen and put that on the table and make him react to that. I was getting, before that debate, I was getting messages from people in other Republican campaigns saying, how can you guys in the press let him get away with this crap? Because they all thought something was ultimately going to take him down. How can you let him get away with this crap? You need to challenge him more strongly. And I took that seriously because he was running against serious people who ended up not acting like serious people in the campaign, but he was running against serious people, people who were actual genuine politicians who had ideological beliefs that were connected to reality and that sort of thing. And the idea that this con man was leading the race was ridiculous. And so I took the attitude that I was going to I was going to foreground the ridiculousness of what he did. Now, what actually happened was that he went bananas. The live crowd went bananas. The Republican viewership went bananas. And as a result, some of those same campaigns that were urging me to be so tough with him, they all came down like a ton of bricks on us.
Yeah.
That's okay. That was a deliberate choice that I made. It didn't have any more effect than what anyone else was doing, but that was how I processed that.
John, I remember that. I remember you, and I preferred your approach. I remembered you caught a lot of grief for that approach, and now it's reminding me that these Republican camps then did fire on you. It's this notion of, and I know you've been this your whole life, is you as a journalist or a reporter, you don't want to be seen as partisan or too partisan. But then, oh my God, we have this new phenomenon here where this is not a normal party and they're untethered to truth. So how does a journalist handle that?
Right. And look, the question of bias in the press has been prevalent for a long time. My father at the Washington Post was the first ever ombudsman appointed at a major American newspaper, the Washington Post, appointed to that job by Ben Bradley, who was the editor of the Post, because they were getting a lot of criticism from Richard Nixon and Spiro Agnew and people on the right about the bias of what they then called the Eastern liberal press.
Right.
He found some of that criticism justified. And so the notion of examining your beliefs or your method of operation as a journalist for bias, that was something I was very conscious of from the beginning of my career. On the other hand, if you're dealing with something that you know is not true, and is not just not true, but ridiculously not true, do you, because it fits the form of journalism that you began in your mind, ignore what you know and treat it as an open question? The left says this, the right says that. Um, and to me, especially now, having done this work for a long time,
Yeah.
if I'm not going to say what I believe to be true, why am I even doing this? Right? I'm not here to pretend or to be a politician and try to court one side by pandering to their beliefs, right? So or their claims. So, if one side says 2 + 2 is 4 and the other side says 2 + 2 is 5, am I indifferent to the truth of those two things? No, I'm not. And
That's interesting, John. Your example of the wall, I think, clarifies this. And by the way, I want to get back to media bias because I want to pick your brain on that in a second. But I think what you're telling me is, okay, we're going to build a wall along the southern border. As a journalist, you can present that as this is a potential policy solution or not. There are two sides to it. Fine. But then when Trump says Mexico is going to pay for it, there's no fucking way that that's possible or true.
right.
That's a different issue than whether the wall is a good or a bad policy.
Right. Exactly.
Okay.
I mean, I interviewed Paul Ryan during the 2016 campaign, and he laughed at that idea. Right? He was the Speaker of the House, and Donald Trump was the candidate of his party. He laughed at the idea because he knew, as I knew, it was ridiculous. And so, are journalists supposed to be diplomats and say and pretend that something that we know is not true might be true?
What did most journalists do back then in the first?
I think it was a mix, and I think it evolved over time.
Okay.
One of the debates we had within the broader journalistic community was, do you use the word lie?
Yeah.
I never really like using the word lie because it has such a charge to it.
Yeah.
And you don't know what's in the mind of the person. And so, how do you separate what's political hyperbole, deliberate falsehood, beliefs that, get carried to the far end of the spectrum? You don't really know. So I was very slow to use that word. On the other hand, Donald Trump is such a pathological liar, nonstop.
Yeah.
And what you saw when you get to the end of the campaign and the candidates who'd been humoring Trump realized that he had beaten them.
Yeah.
And so they started saying what we also knew to be true, that he is a pathological liar. Ted Cruz, you may remember at the end of the campaign, said, "You know what? I'm now going to tell you what I really. I'm going to do something I've never done in this campaign. I'm going to tell you what I really think."
Yeah.
Well, the job of a journalist is to tell you what you really think from the get-go.
Bingo.
Ted Cruz was playing a political game and trying to figure out how can he get the votes from Donald Trump when Trump collapses, and therefore I'm not going to criticize him. I'm not going to say what I know to be true about him. That is not what journalists should do. And so I don't do it. Now, again, I recognize that certainly for younger people who may have been doing this for a shorter period of time, and are less confident in their judgments or more cautious about making judgments, I know that different people handle it different ways, but I can only do it the way that satisfies my conscience, that I'm accurately reflecting what I believe and know to be true.
Did you notice, John, any kind of a generational difference in how the media reacted to and reported on Trump? I mean, you're
I haven't thought rigorously about it.
You're part of an older generation, a different generation.
Yeah, well, I think it is natural that people younger in their careers would be more cautious about making judgments that sound strong.
Yeah.
When you're just starting out, but so that's sort of my instinct in response to your question, but I'm not certain of that.
Or I wonder, John, if younger journalists got more caught up in kind of how entertaining the whole Trump thing was, and the ratings were killer, whereas someone like you who'd been in the business forever can step back from that and not be caught up in how entertaining he is. He's just wrong. He's dishonest.
Right. And again, have one virtue of having a long career in this business is you're not so anxious about the rest of your career as you might have been
Yeah.
early on. And so people are going to be more anxious when they're younger. Like, am I overstepping, or am I doing something that puts my future in jeopardy? And that's the same question that exists on a broader scale. Television audiences are shrinking. Newspaper readership is shrinking. The digital revolution has fragmented the audience. Everybody's going to try to figure out how to hold on to it. Do you hold on to it by appealing more fervently to the beliefs you think your audience already has, or do you try to reach out to people who aren't your audience and persuade them to listen to you? It's extremely hard to do, and nobody's really figured it out. And I hope many people figure it out. But
you had a great quote in 2020. I'm going to read it to you. It pertains a lot to what we're talking about. You said, we're brought up to believe there's two different political parties with two different points of view, and we don't take sides in honest disagreements between them. But that's not what we're talking about now. The Republican Party is now led by a dishonest demagogue. Every word in there is spot on true. And that's the difference, isn't it, John? That's the difference.
Yes. And to the point that I was making there, we should not, and I do not, take a position on what the tax rate ought to be, what the budget deficit ought to be, what our border policy should be. And so when you have people who have what are identifiably coherent views on those things, we are indifferent to those disagreements, but we're not to crazy stuff that's made up and is fantasy material. And if we have the capacity to recognize what some of those things are, like Democrats being pedophiles, or there's any Mexico's going to pay for the wall, or the election was stolen. No, those things are fantasies, and we can say that, and we should say that, in my opinion.
John, I think that's so important, and I think that's the crux of this. I got into an argument last night after or Sunday night after the Marjorie Taylor Greene interview. A former supporter of mine, I said that when you interview her, you can't treat her like a normal partisan member of Congress. She's more dangerous than that. And he said, the only reason she's dangerous, Joe, is because she's attacking the swamp. And I said, no, the only reason she's dangerous is because she's untethered to truth. John, this is, I think, this is what bothers me almost more than anything. And I don't know how your profession deals. We've never, it's okay to have extremist views, but we're in a situation now where I really believe this. One of our political parties is just not operating in the world of basic truth. I've never seen that. I don't know how you cover that.
Well, it's difficult. And again, to my view, is to the extent that you can recognize that, then you call it out. If you're uncertain, and then you're more cautious in assessing that. Even
if you're not an opinion person on MSNBC or CNN, if you're a straight objective person on CNN or MSNBC, you still can't present the both sides of something that's not true.
Absolutely, you cannot, and you should not. Again, to the extent it's in your power to discern the difference. And be able to say, like take, for example, and this is another symptom of the craziness, that whole Pizzagate baloney, right? Yeah. Somebody went and with a gun to that place. That was a preposterous fantasy, a dangerous fantasy. And that is not something that we ought to cover and say, they say that there's child, sex trafficking being run in the basement of this pizza parlor. Is that true? Let's go to the pizza parlor with our camera and find out. And act as if that's an open question. No, it's not an open question. It's crazy talk. And if we can recognize something as crazy talk, call it crazy talk. And that's again my view of the Marjorie Taylor Greene situation. She is an emblem of crazy talk within the Republican Party, and the fact that she has gained clout within the Republican Party over the speaker. The story is about what that says about the party. It's not about her as an individual. It is about the phenomenon that she is surfing and that has led the Republican Party to this place. That's the story.
So it's not, so John, it's not the reporter's job, or it doesn't suffice to just let her spew her crazy talk so that America can hear it. And that's, you don't like that methodology.
I recognize that there are some people who say, let her talk, and people will see the truth that you recognize.
Probably not.
I can't be certain that that's wrong, but as a journalist with a conscience, if I'm covering this person and she's saying something slanderous and crazy about other individuals, I think it's my responsibility to say it is crazy and slanderous, and not go, we'll see. Who knows?
Okay. Well, and even John, even like the whole 2020 stolen election lie.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like throughout that whole period, the media kind of wrestled with and wasn't as strong enough from the outset that this was bullshit.
Well, I'm not sure that I agree with that, in the sense that I think by the fall of 2020, people had adjusted to Trump and the way he operated, the dishonesty of Trump.
Yeah.
And I think there were the preponderance of my colleagues were framing it as something that Trump was making up as an act of demagoguery to, gin up his political base, and that the claims that he was making about a stolen election were ridiculous, that he even made the night of the election. And then, you could see the craziness of Sidney Powell and Rudy Giuliani and all the crap that was floating around with these frivolous court challenges. You had to watch those things play out. So I think by and large, people were framing it in a way that I would also frame, that I did also frame it. But I think, I think we ought to keep on that and continue to do that, because this phenomenon is not going away, and it's dangerous to the country. It's dangerous to our democracy.
Well, and you've got then, John, what you've got then is you've also then got a media echo chamber on my former side of the right. You've got Fox and Newsmax and all the rest that just echo all of this stuff.
Well, and to me, the what we're seeing coming out of the Dominion case ought to be an alarm bell for journalists, in the sense that there's some people who might have been reluctant to frame this political moment as vividly as they might want to, because there was sort of a lingering idea that there was this other point of view, and how real was it? And now to see that the people disseminating that point of view did not themselves believe it, that to me heightens the obligation of people in legitimate, honest news organizations to say what we know and not shrink from saying what we know.
Do you expect anything to happen to Fox in this suit?
I mean, I'm not a a lawyer.
Yeah.
It looks to me as if the evidence against Fox is strong. I think their framing of this as a defense of the First Amendment is complete bullshit.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I would say the tea leaves from the initial judicial ruling suggest they're in big trouble, and I think
Yeah.
they should be in big trouble.
He's obviously running. He's been indicted once. I think he'll be indicted for more serious charges. I come from the Republican Party base. I think this will strengthen him. I don't know for how long. I still think he's the odds-on favorite to be the nominee. Your political and media hat, do you have any sense as to how all of this will help or hurt him toward the nomination? And are you confident the media will learn from maybe what they didn't do in 16 and 20 and cover him more along the lines of what you'd like to see?
Well, let me work backwards from November 2024. I think the chances of him being elected president are extremely low, if not zero. He has only lost altitude since he won in that sort of freak election of 2016, in which there was an intense reaction in some parts of the country to the Obama presidency. Democrats nominated someone who a lot of people really didn't like, and even Democrats, many of them were very, very ambivalent about her. And he sort of thread the needle of the Electoral College. Ever since then, they lost the House in 2018. They lost the presidency in 2020. They lost the Senate. They lost the Senate again in 2022.
Now, the only caveat I'll throw there, John, and then continue. He only lost electorally in 20 by a very small margin again, which scares me.
Yeah, but he lost. And so I think he's only losing altitude.
Yeah.
I recognize that a lot of people who know the Republican Party better than I do are saying that, well, this is now going to make him the nominee or jack up his chances of winning the Republican nomination. I'm skeptical of that. I doubt he will be the Republican nominee.
Why?
I think that
interesting. Why?
Well, if in fact he faces, of course we don't know.
We don't know.
But if in fact he faces multiple prosecutions from different angles, from different levels of government, that's not easy to deal with. A. And B, I do think there is a substantial belief within the Republican Party that many people in the Republican Party are afraid to articulate, but some do, that this guy's a loser. And I think the party has a strong interest in winning the presidency in 2024. And so the combination of burdens on him, the fact that I don't think he liked being president all that much. He liked the glory and he liked the attention and all that. It does not appear that his family really wants him to run for president. He's old, like Joe Biden is. So all that makes me think the combination of political and personal factors will preclude him from being the Republican nominee. But I'm certainly prepared to be proven wrong.
Right. And before you get to the media aspect of it, let me just counter your political take. What scares me is when you look at all the polling right now of my former party, it's like Trump and DeSantis are 80-90% of the primary vote. I know everybody supporting DeSantis is a Trump supporter who just thinks DeSantis can win.
Right.
I know DeSantis. I don't think he's going to wear very well on the national stage. So my fear is that if he falls by the wayside, the base of the party, John, they want a son of a bitch. They want a cruel, authoritarian kind of a jerk. I mean, and they tell me this every day. So if DeSantis faded away, then there's just Trump inheriting all of that. And more importantly, I don't see Nikki Haley or Pence or Pompeo or somebody else kind of tapping into where that ugly energy is.
I mean, that's a totally legitimate point. I think presidential primaries are hard to predict. They may have grown less hard within the Republican Party because of the intensity of feeling about Trump. So,
Yeah.
Everything that I said, all the reasoning that I went through a few minutes ago, may just end up being not valid at all because there's a white heat within the party for him, and you could say that whatever his legal troubles, he sees it as advantageous to be a presidential candidate for fundraising and for whatever presumed protection you might have by being in the political fight. That would somehow provide some layer of insulation to in the courtroom. Maybe.
Hey, John, we're airing this conversation on Wednesday morning. Yesterday, Tuesday, Trump was arraigned. Last night, Tuesday night, he gave some remarks and gave a speech at Mar-a-Lago. We're recording this on Monday, so we don't know if the media recorded him Tuesday night. What's your call? So Trump's arraigned. He flies back to Mar-a-Lago. He's having he's going to spew a bunch of crap at Mar-a-Lago Tuesday night. Should it be covered?
Yeah, I think so. I think you have to under these circumstances. He's facing legal charges. He is going to have a response to the charges. No, it's a matter of degree. If he, do you take the first 15 minutes of it instead of the other hour and 45 minutes if it's a 2-hour deal? Television executives will have to make that call. But you have to. To me, you have to cover that moment. This is a different moment from a political rally. This is now in the legal realm. He has a response to it, and I think you've got to convey what that is.
Back to my question of assuming he'll continue to run and he's in for the nomination. Do you feel pretty confident that the media will cover him in a better fashion than they did in times past?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I think so.
Good. John, get back to this notion of media bias. My basic working hypothesis has always been, as a conservative, I've generally always understood that most people who get into your profession are center, left people. The profession attracts those people. And generally, I've always thought, I don't like the term the mainstream media, but I've always just understood that there's more of a left of center bias. And I think over time, that bias helped give birth to the whole Fox News world and everything now we've got.
Absolutely.
What's your overall take on the notion, the right-wing notion of, and they overplay it, John, clearly, of a more left of center bias generally in most of the media?
Of course it's true. Look, for the reason that you mentioned, people go to Wall Street because they want to make money. People go to go into journalism because they are motivated by a desire to tell stories that, by and large, they hope will make the world a better place.
Yeah.
Comfort the afflicted, afflict the comfortable. That's the little slogan that journalists use. They are not inclined to look at problems in the country and say we don't need to do anything about them. Journalists are inclined to say X and Y and Z needs to change, and so they spotlight things that they think are problems within the society and need change. That puts them left of center.
Yeah.
Journalists are more secular than the country as a whole, so I think one of the greatest underrepresentations in the mainstream media for a long time has been people of faith. So I think that is a legitimate criticism. By and large, people in journalism on social issues, whether it's gay rights or abortion, they agree much more with the Democratic Party's viewpoint than the Republican Party's viewpoint. That's entirely true. But what has happened is that the valid conservative and Republican complaints about that phenomenon have now gotten so outsized and exaggerated that they don't really bear much resemblance to the scale of the issue. again, it is they're not imagining it. It's true, but it's not as important as they seem to think it is. And in reaction to that, you have the flowering of this real craziness and extremism on the right that has to be described accurately, which then, of course, causes more angst on the right, saying, "Oh, well, you're being unfair to us." Well, there's a point at which that fairness issue is valid, but Marjorie Taylor Greene is in a place where that's not the issue. That's not what it's about. It is about her behavior and the behavior of people like her that is disconnected from reality.
John, the notion of the understandable left of center viewpoint bias that's always been there, is it more pronounced now? Was it more pronounced 30 or 40 years ago? What have you seen, or is there a pattern to it?
Well, I think there have been a couple of waves of it. I think there was an initial question in my dad's day of recognition.
Yeah.
And one of the things that he wrote about was that the people who were working at these big news organizations, who came out of World War II and went to college and then went into journalism, very idealistic people, many of whom were Ivy League educated.
Yeah.
And they were not, my dad was an orphan kid from the Midwest who joined the Marine Corps, fought on Iwo Jima. That's one of the reasons why they leaned on him to do this job, because he wasn't an Ivy League kid.
Wow.
And he saw that there was some validity. There was some gap in the comprehension of his colleagues with that world that they weren't from.
John, how would you, broadly speaking, how would you have described your dad's politics?
My dad was a contrarian. He was somebody who, I would say, by the end of his career, he was seen as sort of an in-house conservative at the Post, because he was pushing back against what we're talking about.
Okay.
I think in the 1950s, he was in favor of civil rights, as most journalists at the mainstream media, but not just New York, Washington mainstream media. He started at the Nashville Tennessean and the Louisville Times.
Right.
So pro-civil rights. But to take an example, in the 1960s, he was very strongly in favor of the war in Vietnam.
Oh.
With fierce arguments in my house between my peacenik mother and my dad, who was very hawkish. They were and there were politicians who lived in our neighborhood, and I remember screaming arguments about the war. Now, he changed when he went over and spent several months in Vietnam and came back and said, "No, it's not what I thought."
Yeah.
So that was different. But Dad was assigned. I'll give you an example. Dad was assigned to cover Bobby Kennedy in the 1968 campaign.
Yeah.
Why was he assigned? The reason was that John Kennedy had been very close friends with Ben Bradley, his boss, had been very close friends with John Kennedy.
John Kennedy.
And many of those people around Kennedy were a little too soft on them, and they came to share that judgment.
Okay.
My dad had critically covered the Bobby Kennedy Justice Department, and he was assigned with the idea that he was hostile to Kennedy, or not hostile, but was not a sycophant to Bob Kennedy.
Yeah.
So he was assigned to cover the campaign, and there was a lot of tension in his description. In fact, early in the campaign, he wrote a piece in which he said that Kennedy was being demagogic in his in some of his attacks on Johnson. And there was an incident on the campaign plane where Ethel Kennedy wadded up the Washington Post and threw it in his face on the plane. And however, like many people who covered Bob Kennedy in '68, he grew to admire and fell in love with Kennedy as a political figure. And after the Oregon primary, which was the first campaign event that Bob Kennedy ever lost to Gene McCarthy, they were getting ready to go to California, and Dad called Bradley and said, "You have to take me off this campaign because I'm not objective anymore. I admire him." And a couple of days later, he was on the floor with Bob Kennedy, who had a bullet in his brain and was holding his friend. And then
Oh my God, John.
Yeah.
That's incredible. And that's incredible that he called Ben Bradley and said, well, and it goes, again, it goes to your politics aside. It goes to how captivating a politician Bobby Kennedy was.
Yeah. And you now hear,
wow.
And I heard this from many of my friends, let's say, who were involved in George W. Bush White House.
Yeah.
Pete Wehner, you probably know, was a major figure in the Bush White House. He's a huge admirer of Bob Kennedy. And the one Democrat that many contemporary Republicans will cite as somebody that they admire is not, to some extent, John Kennedy, but considerable extent Bob Kennedy. And that just shows sort of, in retrospect, the glow, the view changes. They certainly weren't saying that at the time, but Kennedy had he had changed from the way he was perceived earlier in his career. And he, again, the journalists fell in love with the guy, and that's why Dad said he wanted to go off the campaign.
Just a political question I'm curious about. If Bobby had never been killed, he would have secured that nomination, correct?
I've had that conversation with one of Bobby's campaign managers or principal strategists at the time.
Yeah.
No longer living, a guy named Fred Dutton. I think he was skeptical.
Really?
This was years later, we were talking skeptical that it really would have happened, that Humphrey might have had enough institutional heft to hold him off, but we don't really know. It was certainly a different circumstance where there was more ability by party insiders to move delegates than there is now. There weren't as many primaries.
When did your dad pass away?
2001.
What did he think of? I have two questions. What do you think of Jimmy Carter? What do you think of Reagan? And then I want to know what he would have thought of Trump. What did he think of Jimmy Carter?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. It was funny. There was after Watergate, Dad was the national editor during Watergate. Mrs. Graham bought the paper in Trenton, New Jersey, the Trenton Times, and sent Dad up to be the editor. So he went my freshman year of college to be the editor of that paper. And I came home in the summer of 75 and was working a summer job. And Dad called me and said, hey, you want to meet a presidential candidate? He's coming into our editorial board today. He says, you got no chance to win, but you might enjoy seeing him questioned. It was Jimmy Carter.
Oh, that's interesting.
After 2 years, the Post decided that the Trenton Times, though it was a success journalistically, it wasn't making money. So Dad then came back to the newsroom. So he was superintending a lot of the coverage of Carter during that time.
What would he have told you about Donald Trump? What would your father have said? And do not hold back, John Harwood.
No, look, I think he would have seen clearly that Donald Trump is a lying con man, and that's what he is, and it is his in part the memory of his imperative to tell the truth. When he was when he died, Ben Bradley gave a quote, or actually, I guess it was in Ben's memoir, when he was describing my dad, who was one of his principal lieutenants. He said he was almost primitive in his search for the truth.
Wow.
And I think that he would have gone primitive on Donald Trump.
John, that's a great line. That's a great line.
I think there were things he admired about Reagan because he was a very Dad. Again, he was an Iwo Jima Marine. He was active in the Marine Corps Historical Society after he left. when he was in his adult life as a journalist. So
Right.
he was very attuned to patriotic sentiment. And I think there were aspects of Reagan that, apart from the economic stuff, that were about feeling of country, about country. I remember at one point when I was a kid in high school, and there was a lot of protest against the Nixon administration and all that stuff, and would talk to Dad, and he thought Nixon was a bad guy, and he'd covered him for a long time.
Yeah.
But he said during that time to me at one point, don't ever forget, this is the greatest country that's ever existed on the face of the earth. And I think he was in tune with that sentiment, and to the extent that Reagan was trying to revive that sentiment, he was sympathetic to that.
Hey, John, where are we? You were last with CNN. You left there, 7, 8, 9 months ago. And I don't want to get into that, but as you look at the landscape now, the cable news landscape, Fox is what it is. To me, MSNBC, I go on MSNBC a lot and CNN a lot. I love going on both. MSNBC has their perspective. I don't exactly know what CNN's trying to do or be.
Well, look,
thought?
They are trying, like every news organization, to build and sustain an audience, and it's hard.
Yeah.
And I want them to succeed. I think CNN's a very important institution.
Yeah.
And I think that Fox is in a different category because they're willfully dishonest.
Yes.
Okay? I covered Roger Ailes as a political consultant, and that's the wellspring of Fox News. It was a political sentiment.
Yeah.
News organizations are different. Even if you accommodate or accept the belief, as I do, that yes, mainstream news organizations do lean left of center, they're still fundamentally grounded in and motivated by the desire to tell the truth. CNN has tried to cultivate, for good reason, the idea that they are a straight news organization that can appeal to a large number of people. It is a more difficult time to try that, given how where the Republican Party has gone.
Is there an audience, John? Is there an audience for that?
I hope so, and I believe there must be, but that's yet to be proven. Obviously, it depends on the moment. I mean, ratings were different when Donald Trump was president. Donald Trump used to talk about this and say, "Oh man, you're going to be sorry when I'm gone." I'm sure from a business perspective, there are many television executives who say, "Yeah, that would be great," and they're enjoying to some degree this moment when the legal system has brought him back center stage, even more so than he would have been as a candidate. But no, we're going to get beyond Donald Trump sooner or later, and I think it's likely sooner. That doesn't change the currents within the Republican Party that he's been surfing. Those are still going to exist.
Completely.
I think that we need to have. I think CNN is a vital institution in the country, and I want it to flourish. And nobody's figured this out. It's not like it's easy. Like, if you do this, then you're going to have this audience. No, people don't know.
Well, and John, as you know, outside of Fox, which is an older white audience, so they're still doing gangbusters on cable news. I mean, overall, younger people don't go to cable news to get their information like we did in our day.
I've got 3 daughters. None of them have cable television. And not only do they not have it, they wouldn't even consider having it.
They wouldn't.
And no, I mean, forget watching me, which they've had plenty, more than enough of for their taste for a long time. But no, that's not something that they would invest their money in. They would, they'll watch stuff on their laptops or use Hulu or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
And maybe if I have a Comcast password, they'll use that, but they're not going to pay for it themselves. And that's the challenge. So you see everybody trying to figure out, okay, well, how do we make streaming work? And do you make it free or do you pay for it? When I started, the largest single chunk of my career was at the Wall Street Journal.
Yeah.
I was a newspaper reporter most of my career.
Yeah.
And when the internet happened, almost every other major news organization decided that the answer was to give it away for free, because then you're building an audience and you can advertise against that. The Journal could do something different, and they did, because they had a more affluent audience that they could leverage their desire for business and financial news to make them pay for it. Later, reluctantly, other news organizations said, yeah, if we're going to make this work, we're going to have to make money off of the online issues of our paper. So they're all charging now. But other than the New York Times, which has been extremely good and successful in figuring this out, it's really tough for others. And do you charge by the article or do you charge by a monthly subscription? And how do you make it work financially? Look, the financial basis of the news industry has substantially eroded. Yeah. And I dearly hope that the clever people in charge of big television networks and newspapers figure it out, because I think it's important for democracy that it be figured out.
Hey, John, I'm going to close with a compliment for you and then two quick questions. The compliment is, and I think this might have been around when you left, around the time that you left CNN. And I complimented Biden as well. I loved Biden's speech on democracy, the one that he got ripped on. And I love that Biden made defending democracy the issue in the midterms. I think he was told not to, and I'm glad he did. I loved what you said. You said, I think when you were on CNN, or you wrote it or you said it, but you boldly came out and you said that Biden was correct to talk about a threat to democracy. I thought that was just wonderful.
I think it's real. And
I
look,
can tell.
The January 6th was, if a wake-up call was required, seeing people violently attack the Capitol, that's the wake-up call. And it was a wake-up call for politicians, those in the Capitol, and certainly you saw the immediate reaction in both parties that night. Of course, it faded very quickly within the Republican Party, and it was a searing event for my colleagues who were in the Capitol that day. Yeah, and it's that's something we hadn't seen before, and I think it's I think the threat to democracy is real, and it needs to be confronted. I will say that Joe Biden emphasized that issue in the campaign. It appeared to have a positive effect on the outcome in some cases. And the dog that didn't bark, I think, was also important. Many of these election deniers who lost their elections conceded the races. That's a critical thing. That doesn't mean that that's going to happen going forward, but that was a salutary result of the campaign, and I hope we see more of that.
Okay, don't bullshit me. Give me a straight, honest answer. Are you bearish or bullish on this American experiment? As
bullish.
We sit here, you still are.
Look, everybody has to decide. Are you the half empty person or the half full person? Are you a temperamental pessimist or temperamental optimist? I am a temperamental optimist. If I weren't, it would be hard to get up in the morning. So yes, I am confident. I do think that ultimately, the Obama had the statement. I think he was quoting Martin Luther King. The arc of history is long, but it bends toward justice. I think it also bends toward truth, and I think part of the story of America is 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But the expansion of rights and dignity for more people, making a more open and prosperous society, it's a fight, and incumbents and I'm speaking broadly, not just political incumbents, but incumbent industries, incumbent races, incumbent genders, those that have power are reluctant to give up power. And I think a lot of the intensity of the resistance within the Republican Party comes from the fact that, 80% of America was white Christians in the 1960s, and now it's under 50%. I think that creates a sense of a threat for a lot of people. That my country, that I'm losing my country, and that threat is what has taken the Republican Party in the direction that it's gone. And I think that over time, people are going to see that you can't stop history, you can't stop change, and that's how we move forward.
I will say this, John. I'm a dark Irishman, so I vary on whether I'm bullish or bearish. I'm not bullish on the Republican Party, my former party. I really worry that they may be too far down a track. And maybe something else will come along. Maybe there's another party. Maybe we're at one of those seminal moments. I don't know. But I worry about the Republican Party big time. Only because I'm curious. Just give me a short answer. I'm curious about your dad. If I asked your dad bullish or bearish, what would he say today?
Same. I think he would say bullish. Yeah.
Okay. Hey, last.
Although
what?
One of the things that was characteristic of my dad was he was a tough guy. This whole ex-Marine tough guy thing. He was very intimidating to the reporters who worked for him at the Washington Post, to all of my sister's boyfriends, and to me as a young journalist. When I first started my career, I was at the paper in Florida, the St. Petersburg Times, brought all my clips home and asked him to read them, and he reads them and he says, to tell you the truth, I don't see anything outstanding in there. And, I wanted to jump off a building. But later I knew that when he said something nice, that he really meant it. But when he was sick toward the end of his career, I wrote a front page story for the Journal during the height of the Bush-Gore, legal fight. And I showed it to him. I don't even remember what the story was. And I showed it to him and he said, "This crap is an example of what's wrong with journalism today. You're all wrong on this or that." I don't even remember what he was criticizing, but he was a tough guy, but there was a tender heart under there, and
he was glad, John. He was glad that you got into this field, correct?
I think so.
Yeah. Hey, last question, my friend. What's one thing you wish people understood about you?
About me?
About you. That's my favorite question.
I mean, that I, with humility, am trying to see the world, understand the world, see it clearly, and share that understanding with others. There are some people who, based on how you're describing a point of view that they may associate themselves with, think that you're out to get them or trying to assail them. No, I'm not. But I've got to take the world as I find it and convey that understanding as best I can, and that's what I'm always trying to do.
Perfect answer. Follow him on Twitter at John J. Harwood. John Harwood, my friend, thanks so much.
Thanks, Joe. Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening. Remember to listen, share, and follow White Flag with Joe Walsh on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere great podcasts are found. And be sure to leave a 5-star review. This has been White Flag with Joe Walsh.